When my brother called to tell me he'd sold our father's land, I laughed. Not a polite laugh, not a nervous laugh. A real, from-the-gut laugh that probably scared him more than anything else I could have said. He went quiet on the other end of the line. I could hear him breathing. "You think this is funny," he said. "Theodore," I said, "you have no idea. I should back up. My name is Leonard Marsh. I'm 61 years old. I spent 32 years as a structural engineer, most of them with the same firm in Columbus, Ohio, before I took early retirement to help care for my parents. My father, Hector Marsh, built a trucking business from a single second-hand freightliner he bought in 1971. My mother, June, kept the books, raised 3 kids, and made sure the house on Callaway Road always smelled like something good was on the stove. They were not wealthy people in the way that word gets thrown around now. But they were solid. They owned things outright. No debt, no pretense. My father passed 3 years ago this past October. My mother followed him 14 months later. She told her doctor she was tired, and I believed her. 53 years of marriage. I think she simply didn't want to do the next part alone. They left behind the house on Callaway Road, 11 acres of land on the edge of Franklin County, and a small commercial property in Gahanna, a strip of 3 storefronts my father had bought in 1998, when the neighborhood was still considered a risk. The tenants were a dry cleaner, a Vietnamese sandwich shop, and a tax preparer who had been there so long she was practically family. The property was worth, by the most recent appraisal, somewhere between $800,000 and $1 million, depending on who was doing the math. My father's will was clear. The estate was to be divided equally between his 3 children, me, my brother Theodore, and my sister Cecile, a third to each. The executor was to be me, a role my father had given me in writing, and in every conversation we had about it over the last decade of his life, Theodore had always had a problem with that. He was 54, 3 years younger than me, and he had spent most of his adult life making decisions that required other people to clean up after him. 2 divorces. A landscaping business that folded in 2019. A period in his early 40s where he borrowed money from our parents and called it an investment and never paid a cent of it back. My mother used to say Theodore had a good heart but bad judgment. My father knew the end, stopped saying much about him at all. Cecile was different. She was a high school principal down in Chillicothe, sensible and steady, and when our parents died, she told me plainly, "Just do what Dad wanted and tell me where to sign." She trusted me. I didn't take that lightly. The estate settlement moved at the pace these things always move. Slowly, with paperwork and with a probate process that had more steps than I remembered from the last time I'd been through anything like it. I kept Theodore informed, every appraisal, every filing, every communication from the attorney. I sent it all to him by email and by certified mail because I had learned, over the years, to document everything where Theodore was concerned. He started calling in February, about 5 months after our mother died. At first, the calls were reasonable. Questions about the timeline, about when distributions would happen, about whether the commercial property should be sold or held. I answered every one of them. Then the questions started shifting. He wanted to know if we could restructure the distribution. He talked to someone, he said, a financial advisor, though he never gave me a name, and this person had told him there might be a tax advantage to selling the Gahanna property as quickly as possible. I told him the property was already under a management agreement, and the tenants had leases. We couldn't just sell it overnight. He said he understood. He called again 2 weeks later. By March, the calls had changed tone entirely. He wanted his third released early, before the estate closed. I explained, for the 3rd time, that wasn't how probate worked. He told me I was being controlling. He told me I had always been our father's favorite, and I was using this as a way to keep my hands on something that didn't belong to me. I let him say it. I'd heard versions of this my whole life. What I didn't know, what I didn't find out until much later, was that Theodore had, somewhere in late February, decided to take things into his own hands. I was in Savannah that April. My daughter Renee lived there with her husband and my 2 grandkids, and I'd promised her I'd come down for her son's 8th birthday. I was gone for 10 days, left on a Thursday, came back on a Sunday. The call came on my 7th day there. It was a Saturday morning, and I was in the backyard watching my grandson try to teach the dog a trick that the dog had no interest in learning. My phone buzzed. Theodore. I almost didn't answer. "Leonard," he said, the moment I picked up. His voice had a quality I recognized, the particular flatness he got when he was trying to sound casual about something he knew was going to land badly. "I need to tell you something. Go ahead." "I found a buyer for the Gahanna property. We're signing Monday." I stood very still. The dog ran past me. My grandson yelled something. "Theodore," I said. What are you talking about? He explained it the way you explain something to someone you expect to be angry, fast, with a lot of justification packed into every sentence. He'd found a developer. Cash offer. They wanted to close quickly. He'd consulted an attorney who told him that as a co-beneficiary, he had standing to move forward. He'd talked to Cecile, he said. She was on board. I didn't believe the last part for a second. You don't have authority to sell that property, I said. I'm the executor. Your attorney is slow-walking this, he said. We're losing money every month it sits in probate. That's not how... I've already signed the purchase agreement, Leonard. I just wanted you to know. He hung up. I sat down on my daughter's back steps. The dog came over and put its head in my lap. Renee came out a few minutes later, took one look at my face and said, Dad, what happened? I told her. She went inside and came back with 2 cups of coffee, and we sat there while I thought through what I actually knew versus what I was afraid of. Here's what I knew. Theodore had signed a purchase agreement on a property he did not have legal authority to sell. As executor, that authority was mine. A purchase agreement signed by a beneficiary without executor authorization was not enforceable. I knew this because I had spent the last 6 months working closely with an estate attorney named Patricia Good, who had been practicing probate law in Franklin County for 27 years and who did not miss things. Here's what I was afraid of. That Theodore had found some angle I hadn't anticipated, that the buyer was sophisticated enough to tie the property up in litigation, that Cecile had actually agreed to something, that this would take years to sort out and cost everyone money and end whatever was left of my relationship with my brother. I called Patricia from Renee's kitchen table. She picked up on the second ring, which told me she was already aware. I heard, she said. Theodore's attorney contacted my office yesterday. Can he do this? No. He cannot. She was measured, but I could hear something underneath it. What he's done is create a problem, but it's a problem with a solution. She explained what had to happen. We would need to file immediately to formalize my authority and make clear on record that any sale required executor sign-off. The buyer, a development company based in Dublin, would be notified. If they were legitimate, they would back off. If they weren't, they'd try to litigate, and they would lose. But it would take time. How did he think this was going to work? I asked. Patricia paused. I think he was counting on you not finding out until after the closing. I flew home the next morning. What happened over the next 6 weeks was not pleasant, but it was not complicated. The buyer received a letter from Patricia's office on Tuesday. By Wednesday, their attorney had called to say they were reassessing. By the following Monday, they had withdrawn. The purchase agreement Theodore had signed was voided. Theodore hired his own attorney and filed a complaint with the probate court claiming I had mismanaged the estate. The complaint listed 4 specific grievances. Patricia reviewed each one and sent me a document that addressed them point by point. None of them had merit. The court agreed. The complaint was dismissed in early June. Cecile called me when it was over. She had never agreed to anything, as I'd suspected. Theodore had told her he was exploring options, and she'd said something vague and noncommittal that he'd apparently decided to interpret as consent. She was furious with him in the quiet way she had, which was worse than shouting. Is there anything left to fix? She asked me. The estate is still on track, I said. Closing by August if nothing else goes sideways. And Theodore's share? He gets exactly what Dad said he gets. A third. She was quiet for a moment. Dad would have handled this the same way. I think she meant it as a compliment. I took it as one. What Theodore didn't know, what he never knew, because there was no reason for me to tell him, was that the gain of property had already been the subject of a separate conversation months before any of this happened. Shortly after my mother died, before the estate was even formally opened, I had a meeting with Patricia and with a financial advisor I'd been working with for years, a man named Stephen Cho, who specialized in estate planning and had helped my father structure his affairs back in 2015. The 3 of us sat down and went through everything. The house, the land, the commercial property, and talked through every scenario. One of the scenarios was this. What if a beneficiary tried to act unilaterally? It wasn't hypothetical. Patricia had seen it before. Stephen had seen it before. I had, if I was honest with myself, seen it coming, so we had prepared. The management agreement on the Gahanna property had been structured specifically to prevent a unilateral sale. The title was held in a way that required executor authorization for any transfer. These weren't unusual protections. They were standard in well-managed estates. But they had been put in place deliberately, with Theodore in mind, without Theodore's knowledge. When he signed that purchase agreement, he was signing something that could never have closed. The buyer would have discovered this during title review. Theodore had handed a developer a void contract and embarrassed himself, and the only question was whether he'd known it was void or whether he'd been too eager and too certain that I would be caught off guard to check. I think was the second one. I think he'd been so sure that I was thousands of miles away, distracted by birthday cake and grandchildren, that he hadn't done his homework. He was right that I was distracted. He was wrong about what that meant. After the complaint was dismissed and the estate moved forward, Theodore went quiet. He didn't call. He didn't email. The distributions were processed in August, just as I told him they would be. A third to each of us, exactly as our father had wanted. The check went to his address. He cashed it. He never said thank you. He never apologized. I didn't expect either. Cecile came up to Columbus in September, after everything was settled, and we had dinner at a place near the short north that our parents used to like. We talked about them more than we talked about Theodore. She told me a story about our father I hadn't heard before. Something that happened when she was 12, a summer when the business was struggling and he'd taken a second job driving for a competitor just to keep the health insurance. He hadn't told any of us until years later. He was like that, she said. He just handled it, didn't make a production of it. I thought about the Guyana property, about Patricia's office working quietly for months, about Stephen walking me through title structures on a Tuesday afternoon in a conference room while my mother was still in hospice. My father had left me more than property. He left me a way of moving through hard things, not loudly, not with a lot of announcing, but thoroughly, carefully, with documentation. I raised my glass. Cecile raised hers. We didn't make a toast. We didn't need to. Outside, Columbus was doing what Columbus does in September, cycling through 3 different kinds of weather in a single afternoon. By the time we left the restaurant, it was cool enough for a jacket. Cecile pulled hers on and said she needed to get on the road before it got dark. We hugged in the parking lot. Same time next year, she said. Same time next year, I said. I drove home on 315, the way I always did, past the exit my parents used to take, past the stretch of highway I'd driven 1,000 times since I was old enough to have a license. The city lights spread out to the south. The river was somewhere in the dark below the bridge. I thought about my father driving that Freightliner in 1971, 24 years old, and betting everything on a single truck and a route nobody else wanted. I thought about my mother at the kitchen table with a ledger and adding machine, making the numbers work. I thought about what I would tell my grandson someday when he was old enough to understand it. Not the legal details, not the probate filings, not the voided purchase agreement. Just the thing underneath all of it. You prepare, you document, you stay calm when someone else isn't. And when the phone rings and the news sounds bad, you make sure you already know something they don't. That's the whole thing, really. That's all of it. I've thought a lot about what my father actually left me. Not the property in Guyana, not the 11 acres on Callaway Road, not the distributions that finally cleared in August. Those things mattered, but they weren't the inheritance that counted. What he left me was a way of handling things, quiet, thorough, without drama. He never raised his voice in a crisis that I can remember. He just worked a problem in front of him. When the business was struggling, he drove for a competitor and said nothing about it until years later. When something needed doing, he did it, and he did it carefully, with the kind of attention that meant it stayed done. Theodore never learned that. I don't say that with contempt anymore, though I won't pretend I never felt it. I say it because I think it's simply true. He spent his whole life looking for shortcuts, and the shortcut he found in February, forging a purchase agreement on a property he had no legal authority to sell, was the same impulse he'd had at 40, at 35, at 22. The mechanism changes. The pattern doesn't, and here's what I've come to believe about that. The pattern always catches up, not because the universe is keeping score, not because of anything mystical, just because shortcuts, by their nature, skip the part where you build something solid. Theodore signed a contract that could never have closed because he didn't do the homework that would have told him why. He was so certain I was distracted, so certain he'd finally gotten ahead of me, that he skipped the step where you check the title structure. That's what impatience costs you. Not always immediately, but eventually. I had prepared for exactly what he did because Patricia Good and Stephen Cho and I had sat in a conference room and asked the uncomfortable question, what if a beneficiary tries to go around the executor? We answered it. Rebuilt the answer into the title before anyone needed it. That's not cleverness. That's just the discipline of thinking a problem through before it arrives instead of after. Renee asked me, the morning after Theodore called, if I was okay. I told her I was fine. She looked at me the way she has since she was about 14, like she's deciding whether to believe me. I told her the truth. I wasn't upset. I was tired. There's a difference between those two things, and I think knowing the difference is part of how you get through something without it breaking you. Cecile handled it the way she handles everything, steadily, without making it bigger than it needed to be. She'd been dragged into something she hadn't agreed to, and her response was to ask what she could do to help and then do it. That's character. Not the dramatic kind that gets rewarded in public. The quiet kind that shows up when the paperwork is piling up and nobody's watching. I think about what I want my grandson to understand someday, not the legal details, not the mechanics of probate or title structures or executor authority. Just this, how you treat the people who trusted you when it would be easy not to. That's the thing that compounds over time. My father built a trucking business on credit and kept it solvent for 30 years because people knew his word was good. That reputation didn't happen by accident. It was built one kept promise at a time. Theodore will cash his third of the estate and do what he does with money. I hope it's enough for a while. I genuinely do. But I also know that no amount of money changes the underlying pattern. He'll find another shortcut, and it'll cost him something again. I drove home from dinner with Cecile in September thinking about all of this. The highway, the river, the city lights, the exit my parents used to take. I thought about my father in that Freightliner in 1971. Betting on himself with nothing but one truck and enough stubbornness to keep going. He left me more than property. He left me the knowledge that doing things right takes longer, costs more effort, and is the only method that actually works. I used it. I'll keep using it. And someday I'll sit down with my grandson and explain it to him the best way I know how. Not as a lecture, but as a story. This one, probably.